But I can point to many, many paradoxes in our society where we set out to do one thing and achieve another. You know, we believe so importantly that we're vulnerable to infection that we sanitize everything to the point where we immediately fall ill as soon as we contact a germ of any kind. We protect our children because we think we want to, you know, preserve them. And by doing that, we make them incapable of benefiting from or even enjoying risk of any kind. Overprotection makes people weak. We criminalize drugs in this forlorn idea that we can rid society of drugs. We certainly don't do that, but we create a very fertile field for organized crime and for petty crime. So, you know, I could go on, but we try to sort of make the humanities return on investment, but by doing that we make them certainly incapable of returning anything and a waste of resources. We misunderstand the nature of what we're dealing with, that things are complexly interconnected, that systems have many complexly recurring loops in them, and they're not linear in this way that bureaucratic organizations imagine things to be. They see a goal and they say, we take these logical steps, and usually we end up in the wrong place. We end up with something we didn't intend. We go for freedom and we end up actually tyrannizing. We've seen this happen, unfortunately, in a number of societies in a disastrous way in living memory. And I believe we're now acquiescing in this in our own culture.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word nuance, which is something that many of us who've sort of been watching the public conversation have sort of said nuance seems to be lost more and more. Like there's less and less space for nuance, there's less and less nuanced conversations. And even the nuanced conversations that maybe were sort of erupting or were emerging like a few years ago seem to have kind of often become more polarized and become more polarized. I think the pandemic had a huge impact. Yes. You see all of these kind of conversations around, like the temperature seems to be raised more and more. Do you think that's related to the situation that you're laying out in your work?
Well, yes, I do, because I think another unfortunate reality is that the more you suppress and repress something, the more power you give it, and eventually it will erupt in a most unpleasant way. And then you say, you see, that's what we were fighting against. But actually, partly you caused the reaction by being so extreme. So in politics, if you stigmatize your opponents as stupid, unimaginative, foolish, immoral, and don't give them the benefit of the doubt, then they will become embittered and more extreme in their views. What always is important is dialogue. It's so basic. Anyone who's ever had a relationship with anybody will know that dialogue is essential to the continuing health of that relationship. And that when things get worse, what you don't do is say, I'm not talking. You say, we must talk. And talk in a civilized way. Again, it's not so much the what as the how of all human activities that seems to me to matter.
And is this a left brain phenomenon where we increasingly see the other one as evil, as wrong, as unable to have that dialogue with?
I suppose so. I mean, one of the definite tendencies of the left hemisphere is black and white thinking. It thinks, in oppositional terms, either this or that. And we see that increasingly in our culture and in our interactions with machines, which is coming on so rapidly that almost year by year one can feel the encroachment into every attempt to achieve any outcome. You're forced to do it through the internet using a computer algorithm which will only allow very simple alternatives. But in life there are no simple alternatives. It's yes, but what if? And if the circumstances are like this, then what? And so on. And this is the loss of reason. A reasonable person in the past was able to say, yes, well, the rule says this, I see that. But under the circumstances, I totally understand that actually the right thing to do here is That is increasingly hard to find, and people are frightened. So people are frightened of stepping away from the algorithm they've been told to follow, the machine they've been told to imitate. We are telling people to imitate machines. We are schooling them to do so. We're disciplining them, and if they stop imitating a machine. Now, this is something surely both very important and very mad.
You've sort of sketched out a way that you think the world is that we're in crisis and things are likely to get worse if we're not kind of aware of these dynamics. Yes. Obviously, there's people like Steven Pinker and other optimists who are just basically saying, no, I think the world is getting better. We're just not appreciating the ways that it's getting better. Do you think that they're wrong?
I do, yes. I have a lot of respect for Steven Pinker. Particularly for his moral courage and standing up for science. I disagree with him about a number of things. I've gone into print in disagreeing with his view that basically science answers all our questions. I think actually he's not as simple-minded as that. He's a very clever man, but he tends to express things in such terms, and himself went into print to say that, and I took issue with it. Because science can't conceivably answer many very important questions, perhaps some of the most important questions, which is not in any way to disrespect science. It's to disrespect science and misunderstand it, to claim it can do things it can't do. But I do think that certainly his optimism is well, I don't share it. I think it's based on mistaken reasoning. I mean, a simple example is the idea that people are being brought out of poverty all the time, when what a lot of time is happening is that people who have ancient ways of life which aren't enmeshed with the modern capitalist economy have no wage, as it were, if you try to account for them in a spreadsheet. But they only become truly poor when you uproot them from where they've always lived and their way of life and take them into the cities, put them in a slum and pay them a pittance. You now say before they were paid nothing, now they're paid a pittance. This is marvellous, this is progress. It's just one example of how you can misuse the appearances of a situation because you're not thinking broadly enough. You're thinking only in a very narrow term. And as I say, I mean, or perhaps I didn't say when I was giving my little sketch of some of the things that distinguish the right and left hemispheres, one of the most interesting ones is a pathological optimism in the left hemisphere. And I really do mean pathological. So bad that it is completely in denial when things are very, very seriously wrong. The right hemisphere doesn't do this. The right hemisphere is, if anything, a little bit overcautious, but it's much closer to reality. It's the reality tester, basically. The right hemisphere is our bullshit detector. The left hemisphere is full of it. And part of that is its belief that there's nothing wrong with anything it can be doing. And I've said this before, but a very striking example for many people is that after a left hemisphere stroke and you've got a paralyzed right arm, the person knows perfectly well they've got a paralyzed right arm. After a right hemisphere stroke and they've got a paralyzed left arm, they will deny completely that they have a paralyzed arm. And if asked to move it, they will say, there, I just moved it, and nothing moved. And if you bring the hand round in front of them and say, now move that, they say, oh, that's not my arm, that belongs to that man in the next bed. So it is really, really extreme. It is delusional optimism. And it also goes with the fact that can be demonstrated by inquiring of one hemisphere at a time about its estimation of its own qualities and abilities, that the left hemisphere has a very high opinion of itself and the right hemisphere has a much more modest opinion of itself, which goes in hand with the fact that the right hemisphere is, as I said earlier, more intelligent, not just emotionally and socially more intelligent, but more cognitively intelligent than the left hemisphere. And we know that relatively unintelligent people think they know everything, and that people who are highly intelligent are aware of how little they know.
Dunning